Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and today I'm very honored to bring on an esteemed representative of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, His Excellency Mohammed Ashraf Haidari. Ashraf served as the Ambassador of Afghanistan to Sri Lanka and the Deputy Ambassador to the United States and India. He held numerous roles in the former Afghan government's Foreign Ministry and National Security Council from 2004 until the Taliban's takeover in August of 2021. Between 2020 and 2021, Ashraf also worked as the Director General of the South Asia Cooperative Environment Program. Ashraf is also a TV and radio commentator and has held a number of senior research and visiting fellowship positions in esteemed think tanks like The World in 2050, associated with the Diplomatic Courier, the New America, the Observer Research Foundation, the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Delhi Policy Group. He frequently writes in major U.S. and international publications, analyzing the nexus between human security and protective security with a focus on conflict, climate change, poverty, and displacement. Ashraf holds his master's in security studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and his Bachelors of Arts in political science and international relations from Wabash College. Ashraf, it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you here to speak with me today. I know we're going to talk a lot about your particular and really, I think, high-level view of what happened to the former government of Afghanistan and what needs to happen under the upcoming Trump administration. So I'm just so excited to delve into all these things with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast, which I've been following for quite a while. And I really appreciate all the effort that you have put into this to help give suffering Afghans a voice at a time when most, unfortunately, nations have forgotten about Afghanistan.
It is such a tough time, and it is important. There are so many voiceless people right now. So I'd love to dive right in and talk about the years before 2021. I have had so many guests on here telling me about why the Afghan government fell. But you have a really, you were part of it at such a high level. So tell me, what are the key factors that you saw that led to the collapse of Afghanistan's burgeoning democracy?
Well, I was really fortunate to have worked with the Afghan government and as well as studied and resided here in the United States. And then through my job with the Afghan government, foremost with the Afghan embassy in Washington, D.C. for 7 years, we worked very closely with both the Bush and Obama administrations, both parties. And at the time, Afghanistan enjoyed strong bipartisan support simply because the American people gave the United States and its allies and NATO a strong mandate to help free Afghanistan from terrorism, extremism, criminality, which brought about the tragedy of 9/11, costing more than 3,000 lives. But unfortunately, what did not materialize as the Afghan people expected was that unfortunately, on the part of the four administrations which engaged in Afghanistan, the adoption of a coherent strategy from day one to pursue four intertwined objectives. A, to help give Afghanistan a state where a strong nation with millennia of history, but unfortunately weak states, especially over the past 4 decades. In one case, of course, during the 1990s, the state institutions completely evaporated, first under the Mujahideen and later under the Taliban. And that, of course, gave safe sanctuary to terrorist networks such as Al-Qaeda, which masterminded 9/11 in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the state building process, one of liberal or democratic, didn't get the attention or the resources from the four administrations, primarily from the Bush administration. 8 years in power simply because the Bush administration got busy and bogged down in Iraq. As a result, as in the words of the former chairman of Joint Chiefs, Afghanistan became a war of what we can versus Iraq, a war of what we should or what we must. That's one. Number two is that the United States, under the four administrations, failed to pursue a strategy for peace from day one, from the first Bonn process, which adopted the Bonn agreement. Under that agreement, the Taliban, those reconcilable, of course, that were toppled. So many of them were killed, wounded. So many also fled across the border line into Pakistan. But there were also elements who were willing to reconcile and to be integrated into the formation of what at the time was an inclusive government. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and as a result, this gave Pakistan, especially Pakistan's military intelligence, and an opportunity to reconstitute and redeploy the Taliban into Afghanistan over the following years. And number three was really to help give Afghanistan an economy that had completely collapsed. And to give that economy was by means of investing in Afghanistan's infrastructure, and also to help Afghanistan extract our own natural resources and enabling us to reinvest the revenues from those resources into a productive economy so that Afghanistan would gradually but surely move towards self-reliance, which did not happen. And fourth, at the same time, was to really bring to bear the kind of pressure on Pakistan that they would never again, unlike the 1990s, support the Taliban and their reconstitution, on which actionable intelligence has always existed and always existed given the close ties between CIA and ISI. So unfortunately, because of a lack of such a coherent strategy, or let's say positional grounded strategy for success in Afghanistan, where all those four intertwined challenges were addressed, giving Afghanistan a state, meaning the institutions of governance and rule of law, security and defense, based on a system of checks and balances on the one hand, ensuring that Afghanistan's economy takes off and over time achieves self-reliance on the other, and at the same time pressuring Pakistan to support a peace process in Afghanistan on the one hand, and on the other hand to never support the reconstitution of the Taliban as an insurgency or terror campaign and its redeployment into Afghanistan. Had such a strategy been pursued foremost under the Bush administration, based on strong bipartisan support that existed, with strong popular support from the American people, and from that administration handed over to the Obama administration for 8 years, and then onward to the following two administrations of Trump and Biden, Afghanistan today would have been America's strongest and most reliable ally, and what is, of course, the heart of Asia, with a kind of neighborhood where the United States has very profound strategic national security interest. And also, let's recall that unlike the Soviets, when they were in Afghanistan in the 80s, when the Afghan people actually strongly resisted rank and file, anyone and everyone, youth, even children, who would stop and throw stones at the tanks of the Soviet soldiers. NATO overwhelmingly was welcomed, embraced, and supported. And even as we speak today, Afghans' criticism of NATO is why NATO left prematurely Afghanistan. It's not why NATO was in Afghanistan, because the Afghan people had been through the Soviet aggression and occupation, had been through years of the Mujahideen as divided factions of proxies of different countries. And then, of course, we had also been ruled by the Taliban. The Afghan people knew what the Taliban stood for and what the return of the Taliban would bring, which they did in the post-2021 period. So it is so unfortunate with that kind of support and that part of the world, with simply, that adoption of a coherent strategy, with bipartisan support and a strong mandate from the American people and a strong support from the NATO alliance for the first time in the history of NATO that unfortunately Afghanistan's democratic state building was failed.
Yes, absolutely. It always made me so viscerally angry that our strategy seemed to be just to get rid of Al Qaeda and not to think about the fragility of the state that allowed Al Qaeda to grow and how important it was to strengthen that state apparatus and create, as all the things you just laid out, a stronger economy that allows people to participate and to thrive and succeed, and to take away those, the things that make people turn to terrorism and join the Taliban, or, or join Al Qaeda. So, yeah, all of these things would have been so great to see in our strategy instead of get rid of Al Qaeda. That was such a simplistic idea of what that conflict was
And
about.
today Al Qaeda's
And
back,
that's
unfortunately,
exactly what
fully
I was going to
resurgent.
say is and yeah, they're calling people, they're calling the faithful to return to Afghanistan, saying this is the ideal place now. And I just, how does that feel to hear them say that as an Afghan,
Well, it's
Ashraf?
tragic that this war on terrorism was fought in the name of defeating Al Qaeda, but yet Al Qaeda's fully resurgent under the Taliban. Their very leader, Zawahiri, was taken down in Afghanistan. We know that shortly after the return of the Taliban to power based on that premature and disgraceful withdrawal from Afghanistan. And today, Al Qaeda is actively training, supporting, arming the Taliban of Pakistan along the Doran line, the provinces, enabling them to launch terrorist attacks in Pakistan. And their victims are primarily, as much as it is, of course, law enforcement and security and defense institutions of Pakistan, but the victims are also civilians. It is tragic to see that this has happened with the threat, fully resurgent and not only I think supporting and enabling TTP, but also providing a permissive environment for other regional global terrorists such as Daesh. And look at the resurgence of Daesh in Afghanistan and the targets that they have picked across the region from Afghanistan, where they're victimizing Afghanistan's minorities, including ethnic Hazaras, two targets in Pakistan, Iran, and of course Central Asia and Russia, and all the way to Europe, and as well as here in the United States. We just recently saw FBI arresting that ISIS associate in Oklahoma. No one thought that it could be an Afghan, but now an Afghan traced to Afghanistan, and probably so many others who took advantage of the southern border to enter the United States with threats that we don't know when they would hit.
Yeah, there's so much that has come out of that chaotic decision that was made and never really spoken of again, even though that chaos persists. And so I want to go back though to what might have been done, what could have been different. I've heard many takes on this too. Could we have stopped that collapse of the government, and who had the power to do it? So I would love to know what stakeholders you think could have prevented the collapse of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and then at the same time, what Afghans themselves might have done differently to achieve that goal.
Well, I think that one decision which President Biden made against the advice of his own military counselors, advisors, and that I think this administration wasn't short of that kind of advice from people who had served on the ground, made ultimate sacrifices, seen Afghans and American lives and limbs lost in defense of institutionalization of democracy, freedom, equal human rights. So this administration wasn't short of the right and advice, but also remember advice from civilians, a number of very capable American ambassadors who had served in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. And they wrote repeatedly in a Washington Post and other major publications calling on this administration to, make a kind of course correction to reverse, I think, what everyone was unfortunately expecting to happen, which was a decision by President Biden to completely withdraw use forces from Afghanistan. So, had that not happened, the Afghan forces had already been fighting courageously since 2024. So it was not that NATO forces were uh, doing the dying. They did, of course, were grateful to the ultimate sacrifices they made. Were eternally grateful to the Gold Star families and their continued support. But it was Afghans. But Afghans needed those enablers, so to speak, from close air support to logistics, maintenance, and so much else, on which they had no choice, but they've grown dependent because those enablers were never given to Afghans from day one. That's why I pointed out the, absence of a strategy, in absence of which, unfortunately, all these yearly or quarterly or every 6 months kinds of, you know, um, ad hoc steps were taken to somehow keep the Afghan forces on a life support, but never giving them the kind of enablers that they always requested. And I recall from my own meetings, talking to Department of Defense officials at my level, because I also acted as an acting defense attaché in addition to my other responsibilities at the embassy. And then each time I accompanied the visiting ministers of defense and interior, and they would appeal to the then secretaries of defense and other relevant security authorities here in the U.S., asking them for giving Afghanistan the right enablers, from training to equipment to an independent air force to even long-term capacity through say placing Afghan cadets in various service schools of the United States services, so that much like the way the U.S. Trained and equipped the South Korean army to be where it is today, so that Afghanistan too could stand on our own and prevent this inevitable collapse, which would have been perfectly possible. And again, and going back to the strategy, such a strategy had been pursued. But in the 2020, 2021 especially, it was very clear that for the ANDSF to continue fighting on its own without the enablers, including contractors. Remember that it was not just the U.S. forces which withdrew, but it was also the withdrawal of all the contractors, which on which both U.S. and Afghan forces relied on to fight the Taliban and other regional and global terrorists in Afghanistan. So, unfortunately, that one decision led Afghanistan's growing young democracy down, and with that, much of the gains made over 20 years between 2001 and 2020, one unfortunately went in vain.
It was such a devastating thing to see and to watch, us leave Bagram in the dead of night and not tell our Afghan counterparts that we were doing that, and to see just all of these things that you mentioned, the contractors being pulled out. I had Afghan members of the Air Force contacting me and saying, yeah, we were flying, but we didn't have anything to drop on the Taliban forces that were amassing. So what good are we at that point?
In
And
fact, the
yeah,
process of demoralization of not only Afghan forces, but the Afghan people and also civilians within the Afghan institutions started with the what we call the Doha deal process. It was initiated by the Trump administration, and unfortunately, that fiasco was done in February 2020. And but again, the Biden administration had a choice not to follow through. It had an opportunity, of course, as said, an incoming president to review the situation in Afghanistan, to look deep into the provisions of the Doha Agreement, and then also to see whether conditions, even that basic conditions laid in the Doha Agreement, were met by the Taliban or not. They were not, unfortunately. What the Trump administration and later the Biden administration did was to engage in a coercive diplomacy, using Ambassador Khalilzad to actually coerce the Islamic Republic government into making the kind of concessions, strategic concessions, that no warring side would ever make at the beginning of any peace talks. Even if they did, it would be reciprocated by the other side or other warring sides. But in this case, the Islamic Republic was coerced to make concessions. For example, releasing over 5,000 diehard terrorists, extremists, drug traffickers in return for nothing, which of course demoralized the Afghan people because they were watching, and as well as the Afghan forces. And while emboldening and empowering the Taliban morally, basically jacking up their morale on the battlefield, and as well as politically, and Doha, because they were just talking, but the Islamic Republic was not only excluded, that wasn't part of this deal, but it was coerced into making these concessions. So the process of demoralizing, weakening, and betraying of the Afghan people, of the Islamic Republic government, and of the ANDSIF began effectively in 2017, and then all the way to 2021. That was until it was completely, unfortunately, achieved at the cost of democracy and freedom and equal human rights, and of course, in favor of the return of what we are seeing today. On what Afghans could have done, I think I also, take criticism from our international partners, because at the end of the day, other nations come and go, and they often act based on their own national security interests, defined at the time by the ruling party or government, or in this case, administration. And President Biden had been very clear, I think, since his time as vice president, that the war in Afghanistan was not going well, that he was not interested, that U.S. should pull out and all that. And Afghans have been listening, watching him talk about it. And of course, we should have paid attention. We should have done our part a lot more than the two presidents ever did. President Karzai had almost 14 years, and he somehow should never expected the Americans to stay in Afghanistan forever and do whatever it takes to help us stand on our own. Ultimately, it's our responsibility to do so. For us, it was an opportunity, which I think President Karzai and President Ghani, both of them, failed in, as well as other political leaders that didn't cooperate with them, didn't support them, but dealt with them in transactional ways to basically, float and power as long as they could. So they didn't do their Afghan part, and that's the part that I think no other external player, no matter how committed they could be, could do for another nation, unless that nation's leaders did their part. So that's in self-criticism, which we should take, and I think now, and draw it on it on as a lesson for moving forward.
That makes absolute sense. Yeah. And I can't wait until that time comes when the moving forward can begin. But before that, we have the Taliban. So I remember when the Taliban took power and everyone kept saying this is Taliban 2.0. This is despite the fact that the Taliban were slaughtering people outside of HKIA, and that we already knew how they felt about women. They had taken women as prisoners, forced marriage as they moved through cities in the country. It was documented by journalists. We knew who the Taliban were, and yet all of the Western media continued to use that term, Taliban 2.0, Taliban 2.0. They're a new organization. They even had the same members that had been released from the prisons. We same leadership. So tell me about the developments under the Taliban since 2021, and have you seen any meaningful change in the organization since Taliban 1.0 in the 1990s?
Absolutely. As you said, Taliban and Taliban, these are just, probably at the time they captured Afghanistan, number in probably less than 200,000 versus you have over 40 million Afghans demanding democracy, freedom, human rights, and the institutionalization of this in partnership foremost with our, of course, neighbors to the extent that they subscribe to those values, and then as well as our NATO partners. And as we see from recent conflicts, especially these terrorists roaming around in Syria, they're all the same. They share the same ideology. Of course, carry different labels and promise change, but at the end of the day, we've seen in Afghanistan over the past 3 years that it is worse than their emergence the first time around than now. And now we know it is only in Afghanistan where there's a full-fledged gender apartheid effectively imprisoning a woman in their homes, in most cases driving them into suicidal depression. That's why you have the number of cases of suicides in Afghanistan having skyrocketed simply because of the situation the Taliban have brought about in the country. And these gross human rights violations are effectively causing migration and displacement. Simply, people have daughters who had gone to schools and universities and that had been advancing. And of course, they have wishes and desires to move on. And those who have the means are leaving Afghanistan as we speak by thousands. And of course, these jobless youth as a result of these gross human rights violations, being recruited by terrorists and extremists on the one hand, and as well as their enrollment in these radicalizing madrasas, over 20,000 of which have been opened over the past 3 years. Now, think about the implication of in thousands of madrasas, brainwashing, training, and possibly also at the end arming them to carry out jihad that doesn't exist, is of course by no means condoned by a faith of peace and coexistence and tolerance. Unfortunately, foremost targeting Afghans, but also their deployment across the region and as well as the rest of the world. Think about the implication of that. And so. An economy that is completely evaporated and that is now artificially maintained by injection of foreign currency in the name of humanitarian assistance, which is unfortunately not reaching those hundreds of thousands of millions of Afghans, I would say, in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. And now the number is over 20 million Afghans needing urgent humanitarian aid, with some 6 million children malnourished, and perhaps many starving that we really don't see simply because of, a lack of free press. The Taliban, are completely controlling and censoring any press, so you don't basically see them. So that's what the Taliban understand. And not only that, these issues most affecting Afghans, but also their harboring of some 20,000 terrorist groups, either directly or indirectly, or operating these Daesh or ISIS wings for plausible deniability purposes, where they target certain sects and ethnic groups in Afghanistan in order not to lose any further popular support. They blame it on Daesh. And then, of course, claim to be fighting and defeating Daesh. Well, Daesh has been resurgent under the Taliban. And before 2021, Daesh had been completely defeated thanks to the ANDSF fighting with support from the international community. Now they're back, Al Qaeda is back, and of course, IMU of Uzbekistan is back, ETIM targeting in China is back. Any regional and global terrorist and criminal network is back, unfortunately. Afghanistan remains the largest producer of drugs. A lot of people welcomed this ban on cultivation a year ago, but now we are seeing this week actually reports of opium poppy having gone back to where it stood. Of course, the Taliban have switched also to meth production and trafficking across the region, and of course, in markets of Europe, Latin America, from Latin America to the United States. So you have a variety of, unfortunately, transnational security threats having been resurgent over the past 3 years, with serious implications for regional stability and international peace and security. It's unfortunate that the crises in the world have multiplied, and attention of major stakeholders and powers are so much diverted from what is happening in Afghanistan. But it's important that I think shows like this really call public attention and attention of especially the incoming administration, the Trump administration, to relook, review the situation in Afghanistan, to make a course correction to do what makes sense for the Afghan people and the United States on the long run. Of course, they can keep maintaining tactical measures and place, such as engaging with the Taliban and continuing to support the Taliban through these cash injections. But at the same time, they need to think about the blowback effect and the consequences of maybe short-term gains against long-term gains that the Afghan people and the American people desire to see.
Sure. I'd love to pause a minute to talk about Afghan diversity and culture, because I think that there has just been, in the media coverage in the West of Afghanistan for the past 20 years, or actually the past 35, 40 years, when we see Afghan women, we see a woman clad in a blue burqa. And we don't hear about the Jewish population that used to exist in Afghanistan, the Christian population that existed in Afghanistan, the Hazara, the Tajik, the Uzbek. There's such a huge number of ethnic groupings living in Afghanistan, and there are so many. Just the culture of Afghanistan has shifted greatly under the Taliban, but that's not Afghan culture. So can you just briefly tell listeners who might not be as well versed in the beauty of Afghanistan and its diversity and its love of women? I mean, strong women are a part of Afghan history. What would you say to describe what Afghan culture really is compared to what the Taliban want to paint it as? Because as you said it so perfectly earlier, that all of these Islamic terror groups are the same, and they're trying to impose something, but it's not culturally, that's not what Afghanistan is. It's not what the Afghan people want. So I'd love for you to just briefly talk about
Absolutely.
that.
Well, the name Afghanistan and Afghan is synonymous with diversity. And if you look at our map, it is the heart of Asia. Afghanistan, used to sit on the super highway of the old Silk Road, bringing different cultures, peoples through commerce and sometimes conquests together. And so that's why you have different looks and languages and customs and traditions across Afghanistan, going from one village to another, to even another district to another province. You see a different people, different look, different. And so that's who Afghans are, and diversity really underpins our national identity. Much like the Swiss, if you look at the Swiss and you look at Afghans, we're not only geographically diverse, but also in terms of our very egalitarian nature, since mountainous people like the Swiss and Afghanistan tend to be egalitarian, tend to be democratic by nature. It's not that democracy is something alien to us. It is that democracy runs in our gene, in our blood. That's why we are a nation of diverse peoples who decide for themselves and their communities through shuras and jirgas, where people come together and discuss a local problem, and then decide consensually together, and then act together to implement it. So that's why when democracy was introduced to Afghans, it was nothing alien. That's why we embrace it over time. We had rounds of presidential and parliament elections, and men and women and the elderly across Afghanistan, defying all sorts of security and terrorist threats, and participated in those elections to elect a democratically elected government to represent Afghanistan. And as a result, that's why, according to a recent report by United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, over 95% of the Afghan people, this diverse nation, rejects the Taliban. It's perhaps, let's say 200 or more or less thousand militants brainwashed, radicalized in madrasas outside of Afghanistan, and now superimposing a version of or misinterpretation of Islam on people with 5,000 years of history, and devoutly religious. And as a result, women in Afghanistan, wearing burqa or not burqa, it's their own choice in that society. But now, unfortunately, the Taliban imposing their views through these draconian edicts and decrees, effectively, as I said, enforcing a gender apartheid, which must be codified under international law as a crime against humanity, because it is burying alive over half of our population. Imagine, the United States without half of its population. Could it remain kind of power it is today? Could it just maintain basic, rule of law and stability and peace and name it? It's impossible. Any nation without its women, especially in the 21st century, when Elon Musk keeps sending rockets back to back to the moon, and here we have the Taliban, unfortunately, maintain and supported to send or take Afghanistan back to the Stone Age, and even worse. At least in the 7th century, when Islam emerged, in part, and emerged to abolish infanticide in ancient Arabia. So the Taliban, unfortunately, do not stand for Islam or the Afghan culture. Actually, they're violating the core principles and tenets of Islam and in the Afghan culture. And that's why several ulama delegations visited Afghanistan before 2021 and passed fatwas against the Taliban's atrocities, and as well as senseless killing of civilians, and then send delegations to the Taliban to tell them that what they are doing against women in Afghanistan is completely un-Islamic. It's against Islam, and that's why you have probably over 40 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so the Muslim world, and none of which gender apartheid exists, and all of which women get educated. And several of these member states are in our neighborhood, and they're all Muslim nations, from Uzbekistan to Tajikistan, to Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and of course Iran, predominantly Shia, and Pakistan, and the rest. Even, of course, India itself is a sizable Muslim population. But in all of these countries, in our own very neighborhood, women have access to literacy, education, and of course, higher education and beyond. Because in today's world, in 21st century, no society can achieve sustainable peace and development without women. And it has nothing to do with Islam. It's nothing to do with culture. It's nothing to do. It's just a bunch of terrorists, militants, extremists, and a strategic project which was created in 1994, nurtured in our neighborhood, and given safe sanctuary, training, and armed and deployed into Afghanistan to bring the status quo that we see now. Of course, it is blowing back. We see now the Taliban with Al Qaeda supporting or sheltering Taliban of Pakistan to do exactly what they're doing in Afghanistan.
Yes, it is absolutely spreading. And I think this is a good segue to, what they've done to women. They have not only it's a gender apartheid, but they've killed the economy. Because if you've got, and I wouldn't say that 50%, of the population, the Afghan women were all working prior to 2021. That's not true, just like it's not true in the US. But uh, a significant quantity were, and they held very important roles, and now they can't work. So let's talk about what has happened to the economy and this humanitarian crisis that has been created by pulling women, I think, in part out of the economy. What do you think are the internal and external factors leading to the humanitarian crisis underway in Afghanistan, and how can it be addressed? And has the international community done enough to address it right now?
Well, the matter of the problems in Afghanistan, the root cause, I think something we often forget, is the Taliban.
Yes.
Right? If the Taliban listened to the Afghan people, 40 million, there's less than 200,000, listen to the international community, then they would simply rationalize their way of thinking, their way of operating, and that would be to resume the intra-Afghan dialogue, to reach a sustainable political settlement, which to some extent the Doha deal envisioned, but that part of it was never implemented with support from the international community, especially the United States. And then once that inclusive, legitimate government is created, then the problems of Afghanistan would one by one, as you pointed out, that there's over a billion people, more or less, suffering from all sorts of problems and challenges that their governments, with the different levels of resources and capabilities, are addressing. And Afghanistan would do too. But the matter of the problems, unless this is addressed, would basically ensure more of the same. And that's why is the existence of the Taliban without any change, but actually getting worse and worse, and basically doing away with 50% of the Afghan population that maintains this economic collapse. How can any economy grow on a sustainable basis with half of its workforce, potentially, even if they are not fully in the workforce today, but the potential is there, right? Because if women are at the village level, and they were before 2021, the Afghan families were younger and younger and younger, and no longer conservative in the way that they used to be these past centuries. They were more and more online, more and more globalizing and learning and watching that the girls and women in other parts of the world, in our own neighborhood, are going to school, are going to university, and then stand on their own, help their families and help their communities and society and nation. And that's what the Taliban, unfortunately, discontinued. As a result, that has maintained this economic collapse, which has brought about this very complex humanitarian crisis daily taking lives. And the injection of assistance in the name of humanitarian assistance is not reaching those Afghans in acute need. Even if it did, it's not sustainable. You cannot, keep a nation on a life support forever. Crises happen, nations' interests, change, and as a result, aid dwindles and diminishes. So there is no guarantee that the international community would endlessly provide humanitarian aid to Afghanistan through a totalitarian system which controls everything, and no one knows, whether they really ensure that this aid reaches those in need. So that's where things stand, unfortunately, and unless this status quo is rationalized, again, an opportunity for the incoming administration, President Trump, to basically resume his efforts based on that Doha process to really revise that, strengthen that, and to bring the pressure needed on the Taliban to come back to the negotiation table and negotiate with other Afghan parties the formation of an inclusive and legitimate government, so that Afghanistan is finally safe from these multiple crises.
Sure. Before we get to Trump, I want to talk about the Biden administration because I have been incredibly dissatisfied, and I've said it many times on this podcast. So I'm not one of the people right now. I know there are many people right now who are kind of turning tail on the Biden administration after supporting it for the last 3 years. I think I've been really critical of the Biden administration all along. They haven't said enough about the horror that they left in their wake. They have continued to give money to the Taliban, and they've said that they're going, we won't let you cut off education for girls, but girls haven't been in school for what, two years at least,
Mhm.
now, and it's, we've had completely toothless demands to them. We even, there are 3 Americans now in Taliban custody, and we can't even convince the Taliban to let them go, despite the fact that we give them millions of dollars on the regular. So tell me, what do Afghans think? I've told you how I think now, but what do Afghans think about the Biden administration's policies for the last 3 years? And especially, what do Afghan women and girls think about how they have been supported or not under the Biden administration?
Well, Afghans think from the beginning there's a flawed policy, a policy that betrayed the Afghan people, betrayed their hard earned gains in democracy, freedom, human rights, and all these socio-economic development areas. Um, it's tragic, and I think that's how the Afghan people really think and feel, and they're hopeless and helpless. And they've already talked. I think they're talking every day. They're protesting. They're demonstrating. They're going to every conference. They're in every forum. They've formed all these different non-for-profits, advocacy groups, and making statements every single day, speaking about the consequences of that flawed policy and decision by outgoing President Biden, that coming from a Democratic Party that unfortunately he failed to deliver on the promise of democracy, and democracy being one of the core values that underpins U.S. Foreign policy and U.S. national security. And I think it's a value that, if supported on a sustainable basis, if not in the short run, on the long run, it's guaranteed that it would equally advance U.S. national security interests. And it's this slide that Afghan people are overly critical and rightly critical of this decision. And that's why, from what I know, a lot of Afghan Americans voted for this incoming President Trump. They've even formed this Afghans for Trump group, and they've been speaking very critically of the outgoing administration, but hoping that this incoming administration is going to make up for the decision that they made and laid the foundation for the Biden administration to implement that Doha deal that ensured the fiasco and unfortunately the defeat easily of a growing young democracy by a militant group of less than 200,000. It is such a tragic. It upended millions of lives of people who had invested years, and that includes myself. I mean, when I graduated from Georgetown, I could have just gotten, a consulting job here in DC, and then imagine if I'd worked for 18 years, imagine where I would be today, right? But I accepted like $200 to $400 a month jobs and went and worked, defying daily security threats and terrorist threats and assassination attempts to help build that democratic state in which we truly believed, because we were told in meeting after meeting in ways that today we see, certain officials talk to the leadership of Ukraine or to the people of Ukraine. And those people are counting on the support from the countries with whom they feel and think that they share those values. But unfortunately, at the end, then simply they betrayed him and let him go. And that's not good on the long run for the U.S. national security interests. And now imagine Afghanistan to be in the hands of a bunch of terrorists who are up for rent by any, hostile states in the region or from outside, or if Afghanistan were in the hands of the Afghan people through a democratic government. Yes, imperfect, because no democracy is perfect. Even here in the U.S., we're still having a developing democracy. It's reached a lot of milestones, but democracy is a process. And certainly the Afghanistan's young democracy wasn't without its problem. Corruption was rife, and I criticized in ways that I did. Leadership was poor, unfortunately. Nepotism was rife and all that. But those could have been addressed if we had stayed the course, if we had conditioned U.S. aid effectively to address those problems that we saw up close. And the U.S. Embassy, one of the largest in that region, with thousands of diplomats or contractors, if they had done their jobs to make sure that those reforms in return for the aid that the U.S. taxpayers had been providing Afghanistan were implemented. So again, a lack of a strategy, a lack of leadership, and a lack of vision to see America's national security interests served on the long run through support, sustainable support for democracy, freedom, and human rights, especially in contexts where people demand it and people want you and support you, and there is a potential for success. And that's why I always call the war in Afghanistan a winnable war for sustainable peace and justice and democracy and freedom, because you have the people on your side. And even, of course, in the neighborhood, if the neighbors had seen that sustainable commitment to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan had begun flourishing, even that would have changed public opinion in the region. And perhaps that would have also encouraged publics in the region to demand the same values, to demand the institutionalization of the same values in those countries where authoritarian, totalitarian regimes are in power. But the publics in the region saw, observed daily that that commitment to democracy and human rights and freedom, all these good values, was wavering, was dwindling, was never, sustainable. And as a result, they sufficed to what they got, looking at the failing situation in Afghanistan. And so that's why I think um, I wrote a piece recently in the Diplomatic Courier to say how global demand for democracy is diminished. And one reason is, unfortunately, the situation in Afghanistan, because the whole world, especially those nations demanding democracy and in its institutionalization, watched how those very established democracies betrayed democracy. And those who embraced democracy and believed and invested their lives, blood, treasure in democracy were let down. So think about the impact of the loss of Afghanistan, or just simply surrendering Afghanistan to a militant terrorist group. Maybe for some short-term gains here and there, which, if you talk to some policymakers in Washington, could justify, even some maybe strategists could justify. But at the end of the day, tactical is nothing long-term. That democracy still wins if it is properly and sustainably supported, especially because of the context, and context where people demand it and embrace it.
And I think, I've always felt that part of the reason that we left Afghanistan is that we looked at the amount of money that we had put into creating security, despite the fact that, as you said in the beginning, right, we missed those four things that would have made an actual strategy that could have contextualized a long term commitment to building out a country rather than just defeating a terror group. We weren't looking at it the proper way, but we decided we didn't want to keep doing that anymore. I think that's what happened. And I think
No,
we
the
decided we're going
tragedy,
to
Beth,
bow out.
is that U.S. spent, now we say, $2 trillion.
Mhm.
It was not the problem of A, bipartisan support for a long time, B, resources. It is that just four administrations chose defeat over victory.
Mhm.
And why I say that is because where US is chosen to succeed, it has succeeded. Look, when the United States went to South Korea and helped carve South Korea out of Korea proper. And US still maintains some 30, 40,000 forces in South Korea,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
across not four administrations, but across many administrations. And that's why the Afghan people wonder why, with all the right conditions, with the resources, with the bipartisan support, with the NATO alliance on board, the United Nations on board, Security Council resolution after resolution after resolution supported, and with the Afghan people effectively doing the fighting and dying, that the four administrations, each of them in their own way from both parties, didn't do enough to see this democratic project through, which was winnable, which could have been accomplished based on those, four pillar strategy which I proposed. Get Pakistan right, build institutions of governance, rule of law, and security and defense of Afghanistan, give Afghanistan, an economy, and pursue a peace strategy to completely, neutralize any potential of insurgency, because if the Taliban from day one had been included on the one hand, others eliminated through overwhelming pressure on Pakistan, on which U.S. has significant influence on its own, but also an alliance with its partners and, of course, established allies, Europe, Japan, all of which have more or less maintained financial stability and economic stability in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, if you look at Pakistan right now, it's in debt, and much of that debt comes from the Paris Club, bankrolled by the World Bank, IMF, and of course, allies. So there's no question about the US not having more than adequate influence to pressure Pakistan to close down the Taliban project. Why it did not do that across four administrations is something that Afghans wonder. Had that
Yeah.
project had been closed, The matter of Afghanistan's problem as we speak, we just spoke, that is today.
Mhm.
The Taliban is the matter of the problems today. The matter of problems before 2021 would have evaporated. Then Afghanistan would, like any other developing post-conflict country, would have the problems of weak governance, corruption, jobs, and all these, increasing demand for a variety of services, which should have been met and which could have been met and addressed by so much and treasure that the U.S. Spent easily, and much of also that $2 trillion was, we shouldn't forget, that wasn't spent on the reconstruction and the stabilization of Afghanistan. Much of that was again spent on the military operations of the U.S. inside Afghanistan in the wrong place while the insurgents were on the other side of the borderline. Imagine if a fraction of that resource had been spent to go systematically, either in hot pursuit or from air, and as well as smart sanctions on the Pakistani military and intelligence, targeted sanctions. That would have delivered a deadly blow to the very existence of any extremist and terrorist threat, and that would have finished off Al Qaeda, Daesh, and all these name it terrorist groups that roam around from Afghanistan across the Middle East into Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you basically just answered my follow-on question with that is trying to convince America that, hey, you've already given so much, and they feel that that was a not winnable battle or whatever the leaders may think right now. How do you convince them that the a democracy in Afghanistan and an Afghanistan free from terrorism is vital to U.S. security? And I mean, would you agree with that statement? And um, why do you think that the current status quo is threatening our interests and should take our attention and our money not to the Taliban?
Well, that's why I know Afghans support this creation of the Doge. And I think for the Doge, as much as Seaguard did its best, and that's why they published all these lessons learned or to be learned studies or reports on what went wrong in Afghanistan and how taxpayers' monies were spent. Probably less than $200 billion that was collectively actually spent. And even of that 156 or 60 billion, let's say, that were spent on both the civilization and development reconstruction. And even much of that was funneled and channeled through contractors and subcontractors and aid agencies that were established and pearled to this, weak, young baby state, which should have been resource, but was not. And much of that resource went to those entities with no commitment to stay, of course, because they all rely on that kind of resource to be around as long as they can. And once those resources have dried up, they're all gone. And then leaving that Afghan state, in many cases, without resources, including institutional capacity to carry out their mandate. So, in 18 years, I should also point out that this weak, nascent Afghan state was daily competing with all these pearled, institutions from the international aid community, and we never got enough, or we were never heard enough on the need to build our capacity in terms of enabling us to design it and implement it. We were not there. In many cases, we were completely outside the car. The drivers were all these aid actors, be it military or civilian or in whatever shape and form. And that's why when, the withdrawal happened, the Afghan state collapsed. No one should have expected otherwise because the Afghan state was never built from day one. That's why I pointed out the coherent strategy that should have been there every single day, every penny from U.S. taxpayers, which I hope Doge in the future stabilization missions ensures that creates stateness, that builds an institutional capacity in the targeted state. It's not given or spent through pearl structures that are ad hoc and then just quit and leave as soon as they don't get that. And so that's a structural problem, very much, unfortunately, to do with the Foreign Aid Act here in the US. That's why a lot of these things created back in the 40s, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s need to be reviewed and reformed to ensure that taxpayers' monies are accountably, transparently, and effectively spent to make the impact that the taxpayers expect. But unfortunately, taxpayers, we know, give their taxes. They're so busy with their lives that they don't know what's going on, because they trust the government. They trust the government do what they should, but in most cases it doesn't happen, and we've seen the consequence and implications of that in contexts like Afghanistan.
Well, I've learned so many things listening to you, Ashraf, and I appreciate all of the time you've taken. I have one last question for you, and I would love to have you give a final message to the incoming Trump administration, the American people, the American veteran population, and the world about, your thoughts going forward for Afghanistan.
Well, foremost, on behalf of the Afghan people, I would like to thank the Gold Star families, because their sons and daughters made the ultimate sacrifice. When I was posted to the Afghan embassy in Washington, I almost daily wrote a letter of gratitude on behalf of our ambassador to send to the Gold Star families as the bodies of their dear children arrived here in the US and then laid to rest. And it was because of those sacrifices that we made transformational gains in 20 years. We are less than 100,000, 1 million kids going to school. Of course, before 2021, we had millions of children back to school. Over 40%, I should say, were girls. Hundreds of thousands of girls back to universities, enrolled in any fields of their interests. And we were graduating scientists, nurses, doctors, engineers, social scientists, and increasingly employed across the government. And one of whose ministries was Minister of Women's Affairs, to ensure gender equity and equality, with women as ambassadors, as deputy ministers, as ministers, and women also as presidential candidates, repeatedly running. And of course, we had no doubt that someday, that process continued, that transformational gain had been consolidated and institutionalized, thanks to the blood and treasure of the United States and taxpayers, that I think Afghanistan would have turned into a model democracy in that part of the world. With that said, I wish to also remind this administration that maybe, as I pointed out here, this administration could continue the status quo, making some short tactical gains here and there. And I think no one knows this better than the incoming National Security Advisor, Colonel Michael Waltz, who served in Afghanistan and fought many battles against the Taliban. And he saw up front, firsthand, how Afghanistan had been transformed. And Afghanistan's youthful population, half of them girls and women and youth, that the potential, enough the potential to rise and to make it on their own with the right support. And that knowing this, that discontinuing the status quo, bringing the right pressure on the Taliban, whether by cutting aid, incentivizing aid in a manner that the Taliban would be more responsive to the calls by international community to resume the intra-Afghan dialogue, for a sustainable political settlement that forms an inclusive, legitimate government that, on the one hand, you know, um, gives Afghanistan and that internal legitimacy, but also that external recognition that we need to be back into the international system so that we participate in conferences and forums and et cetera, to help benefit Afghanistan. Right now, we're in complete diplomatic isolation. It's a clear opportunity for the incoming administration to do so. If not, then the administration should think about a set of carrots on its own, but also in a partnership with its close allies and friends, and as well as actors in the region to really bring about the change that Afghanistan needs, and that includes support for the growing resistance of the Afghan people. Now, there are multiple fronts which have been either fighting or waiting for the means to do so, or are being formed, and also to strengthen the Afghan women's voices and to listen to those voices, as I pointed out. All of these things, and there's smart sanctions as well, if the Taliban don't come around and cooperate, then targeted sanctions, especially those leaders within the Taliban that maintain the status quo and refuse intra-Afghan dialogue to address the matter of the challenges. I think this time around, the incoming administration would also perhaps enjoy a more favorable regional environment, with Pakistan now having been harmed from Taliban ruled Afghanistan, with more and more TTP come across the door line targeting the military, civilian, and as well as infrastructure projects, with, of course, Iran also having been targeted by Daesh out of Afghanistan, or even Central Asia being very concerned about the growing threats of Daesh and Al Qaeda, and as well as their own extremist terrorist outfits being harbored by the Taliban. Even from China is very much concerned about the presence of ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, the Uyghur separatists and terrorists in Afghanistan. So this administration has a clear opportunity to build on that consensus among members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council on the one hand, NATO allies on the other hand, and I think their biggest supporter and ally, the Afghan people. I think together, this 200,000 more or less militants could easily be brought into the fold. I'm not, asking for their annihilation, but the resolution of conflict on a sustainable basis. To do so, it requires that inclusive peace process, including the Taliban, where they don't, as I pointed out, respond, then they could be addressed in a different way. So that's the message for the incoming administration and for the American people, as they have demonstrated over the past 3 years since 2021. And for the veterans, we thank them so much wholeheartedly for pretty much doing what I think the US government and this administration should have done. That in most cases, assistance have only been there for 3 months or so. It's the veterans and their families that, spending out of their own pockets to continue providing support for these large extended families of Afghans who've been evacuated. With their support, again, it's not easy as they learn the language, as they make the transition, as they stand on their own. No question about their resilience, about their enterprising genius, that with that support, and the veterans know that. That's why, as Jason interviewed with the 60 Minutes show and is just running, which I've shared, he points that out very clearly. With the right support, they do stand on their own, and they will soon be independent. So we thank the veterans, and we hope that they will continue to support, that they will continue to lobby for relocation of those who have remained behind, and for a, a departure from the status quo in terms of U.S. Afghanistan policy, to ask and advocate for a policy that Afghanistan is reprioritized and prioritized on the agenda of the incoming administration. Especially, I think the hope from the Afghan people really is, and I hope that Colonel Michael Watts listens to this, because I think anyone else probably they wouldn't count on much, but Afghans count so much on his presence in the Security Council that you would convince President Trump, even if he again somehow thought managerially about Afghanistan, its importance. But I think President Trump, as wise, is visionary. If he's convinced, and if he's shown why Afghanistan matters, not only for values but also, imagine once our values have been achieved in Afghanistan, then, economic opportunities are endless, especially investment opportunities for major firms, including, those of Elon Musk, manufacturing electric cars, because Afghanistan is the Saudi Arabia of lithium and other minerals which American firms, Western firms need to invest in and tap into, which the Afghan people really prefer the Western firms as opposed to, these predatory, unfortunately, investors from our region. So opportunities are endless, from strategic to values driven to economic. It really is up to the 4 years of the next administration to and grab these opportunities and implement the right policy, and with the support of the Afghan people. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving so much great context to all the listeners. Um, I learned so much. Thank you, Ashraf.
Likewise, thank you so much, Beth, for this conversation.
Oh, it was my pleasure. And I just want to thank all the listeners too for taking your time, for always coming here to support the people of Afghanistan who have been through so much in the last, not just 3 years, but really the last multiple decades. Tashakor to everyone. And as always, hope to see you again soon.
Likewise, thank you so much. Definitely.